All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. I see some folks trickling in. All right. We're a few minutes over, so I'm sure some more folks will join, but let's dive right in. Really important conversation today, I think, proving ROI and RevOps. So I think, everyone here knows when you can prove ROI and RevOps, you are more likely to get promoted, grow your team, get additional investment dollars to make your life easier and your team more effective. Really a big unlock for your career if you can do this well, but it's not that easy. I think we all know the value at a high level of RevOps, time savings, efficiency, improving the customer journey so more deals are closed and more customers are retained. But I think the nature of the work in RevOps that we do to accomplish these goals is varied, sometimes kind of indirect, and often confounded by a bunch of other things going on at one time. So quantifying that value is hard. I've got Ben Moley here, whose firm Hyperscayle did a lot of really cool work around RevOps ROI, and he's agreed to kind of walk us through how they're actually quantifying this for their customers and others. So Ben, great to have you.
Yeah, thanks, James. It's good to be here. This is a topic near and dear to our hearts, right? Happy to dive in and want to make it a discussion today as much as possible. My plan is to first, kind of talk a little bit about the motivation for creating this, which I think will resonate with all the listeners who I assume are interested or involved in RevOps, in some way. And then, how we came about building these calculators. I'll walk through a few slides of this ebook that we put together that's available that you can download, to go through all of it. And then we actually have some live calculators on our website you can use to like punch in the numbers and play around with, for my scenario, for my company, what do I think, I could justify for this or for that. I won't go through all of these because there's a lot in the ebook and there's a lot on the website, but I'll show a couple examples to be illustrative, and people will get the idea. And all this will be made available afterwards, right? If folks want to follow up. So.
Awesome. Yeah, we can dive right in. I just wanted to reiterate, super open to Q&A along the way. There's a Q&A button here at the bottom of your toolbar, so don't be shy. I'll kind of moderate that for Ben as he dives through. But without further ado, Ben, why don't you kick off? I'm sure I'll have some questions along the way as well, but we can probably get
Yeah.
going.
Yeah, it sounds good. Yeah, and everyone who's listening and watching, please, yeah, chime in. So RevOps ROI, this is a it's a very tricky subject actually, and the motivation for creating the calculators that we have is that we've never really seen anyone do it in a data-driven way, in terms of like how do you actually put dollar values to a RevOps project. Right. And every CFO, if you go to them and you're asking them for a significant investment, if it's, buying a new CRM or hiring a consultancy like Hyperscayle to go do a big project for you, or just your own full-time headcount. Hey, I need, more people to do the things I'm being asked to do. Those numbers add up pretty quickly, and they're a few hundred K to seven figures depending on the size of your organization if you're doing something like that. And so naturally, CFOs will ask for, okay, well, what's the return we're going to get on this, right? What is it worth for us to do this project? Like, why should we spend the money here? And it's a tricky thing to answer. And I think what I've seen is a lot of RevOps professionals really struggle for how to approach that conversation. And so our hope is that what we're going to go through today is gonna will be will create inspiration, right, for like how you can approach this in your own organization. So the first thing I'll say is the caveats is like we have a bunch of math equations. There's some science behind it. I think there's real value to what we've done, but there's also a lot of art here, right? And we're trying to quantify a lot of things that are inherently qualitative, right, rather than quantitative, and that's really challenging, right? It's a reason why nobody's really done it, and we haven't seen it too much out there in the market. So take all this with a grain of salt of like modify this, take this in the way that you think will work best for your organization. And there's nothing sacred about this exact equation that I'm going to show. It's more just getting your gears turning of like how do you think about this, right? And I'll say, it starts with the inspiration for this actually was a lot of our work in the manufacturing world, where often pretty large companies don't really have RevOps at all, right? And now for the first time they're getting interested. And so, the question, in a SaaS company, if you ask like, what is it worth to have a CRM system? It's kind of a laughable question in like the SaaS world, right? Everyone's like, of course you have to have a CRM. Like no one's debating that, right? Like, and probably they're like, well, if we're a real company, we want to have Salesforce, right? Or HubSpot or something. It's one of the big ones. But in a manufacturing company where they're $1 billion of revenue, have been around for 70 years, right? Never had a CRM, literally ever. And then, one champion there who's, kind of trying to change things is going to the CFO and saying, hey, I want to, give me $2 million to go do this CRM implementation, right? that's a big ask, and like they don't get it, right? They don't have any intuition or history for this, and so they legitimately ask the question, what is it worth to have a CRM, right? Like a customer record management system. So, that's the motivation for this. So for many people, it's not an academic question; it's like a real one, and being able to put some dollar values to questions like that is really valuable for the ability to have the right conversation and ultimately get the investment you need to do the improvements that you know your company needs, right? And to help people understand. So I'll pause there. That was kind of the motivation for it, and we can start diving through the structure of it next. Does that make sense, James? Any like, do you have any immediate questions based on that?
No, it does. I'm just going to, even like if you're not having a specific investment conversation, I think this is all super applicable to just the projects you're working on as
Yeah,
well. Like, how do I get visibility in my organization that I'm doing things that matter? Because I think a lot of RevOps folks, at least in maybe the mid levels of seniority, get really sometimes lose the forest for the trees, and it's because they
yeah,
spend so much time in the weeds, they end up talking about the weeds to their superiors. But as cool as that work is and important, superiors don't care. They want to hear about how you move the business forward. So I think this is also a great
right.
framework for that too.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. So, okay, so I'll run through part of this ebook. I'm not going to go through all of it. We'll have a discussion on a few of these points, and then yeah, I'll show some of the calculators. But so scrolling through here, so the first thing I'll show here is the hyperscale RevOps framework, and that's a topic in its own right. So I'm not going to go into the lowest level of detail here, but suffice to say, we hyperscale organize our RevOps projects and kind of structure the conversations with our clients around five main areas: leadership alignment, process definition, team structure, systems and tools, and data foundations. And all of those taken together in our mind is a pretty holistic view of what does revenue operations mean, right? And like, how do you do this well if you've got a really high performing RevOps function? If you have to think about all these different dimensions. And so we have created calculators, ROI calculators for each of these, right? So, and in fact, a couple of them have two because of different nuances of different situations. But nominally, like there's a calculator for each of these five because that's how we think about the world and helps us organize it. So for anyone out there, hopefully this also helps them direct of whatever's top of mind for them. It probably falls into one of these categories and it lets them direct, hey, I can go to this part of the ebook and know where to look, right? Briefly describing what that framework is. So leadership alignment, this is being on the same page with your chief revenue officer, with your CEO, with your CFO, and the VPs, and whatever level of seniority is kind of making the overall strategic decisions. Being aligned with them on what are the sales and marketing goals, how are we going to measure those? Like what will RevOps do to support that, right? In terms of reporting and in terms of systems and automation, how do we know if things are on track or off of track, right? All of the stuff that comes with running a RevOps team, having the leadership team kind of get it. And I think everyone probably on this call has experienced plenty of times where they don't get it, right? And like friction comes up. A classic thing is getting ready for board meetings, right? Every RevOps person hates it because it's just like it's inevitably this, staying up late and oh no, I want the chart to look a little bit different and like surely our MQLs were higher last month. Like, no, slice it a different way because the leadership team has never aligned with themselves and with RevOps about what is the source of truth for data X, for data Y. And therefore and then you get into the meeting and the CMO has done that, the CRO has done that, the numbers don't match, and you spend the whole board meeting arguing about what reality is rather than what to do about it, right? And
Yeah, my
so,
gears are already turning on this one too, Ben, where I wonder if this really if this falls into your category or not. But we hear so often that like the classic sales and marketing misalignment of like what actually is like an MQL or something. So you have all these good leads
yes,
not being worked or bad leads being worked, and I'm already starting to think about how you can kind of quantify that misalignment as well.
100%. That's a great example. Yeah, it's not just the number of MQLs, but then marketing's like, oh, we did 100 MQLs, and sales is like, no, you didn't. 50 of those were crap. They shouldn't count, right? And like it just goes back and forth, and that alignment is always going to be messy, but that needs to happen, long before the board meeting, right? And then like be consistent over the year as you do it. So that's what leadership alignment is. Process definition, our mantra here at Hyperscale is process first. And this is everything about how your go-to-market teams do their jobs, right? I don't think I need to explain that too much further, but that's really important, right? You have to know what you're trying to accomplish and how you want your humans operating, no pun intended, and the technology that you have should serve that, not the other way around, right? So start with your process. What are you trying to achieve? Make the tools bring that to life rather than fitting your process into the tools you have today, right? And kind of jury rigging stuff. Team structure, this is literally for the RevOps team, right? How is it structured? How many humans do you have? What roles do they have? What expertise in systems? How big is the team versus the size of your marketing or sales organization, right? Systems and tools, that's the most obvious one. What do you have for your technologies? How are they set up? How are they integrated? And then data foundations is within those tools, how good is your data, right? Data quality, due percentage, accessibility, data architecture, the ability to modify that and change it over time, all that around data foundations. So those are the five categories of the framework, and so we have calculators for each of these, right? I'm planning to touch on a couple of them in the 20 minutes or so we have here. But that's how we think about the RevOps world, right? And I would wager that most people who are listening to this, if you've got a project in top of mind or a challenge, it probably touches multiple of these buckets. It's not like, oh, this is just a leadership alignment project usually, right? But hopefully this helps structure your thinking in terms of, these are the different elements I need to be thinking about in order to actually drive the change I'm trying to do, right? To move things forward.
Yeah, this is great. I think, at least from our podcast, we for a while were asking everyone how they define RevOps because it's so different, and there are a lot of different answers. But I would say the intersection of people, process, data, and systems was the most common. But I really like that you added like alignment here as well because I think that is an important missing piece.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, our definition of hyperscale is RevOps is a holistic approach to all of the processes and systems that go-to-market teams use to do their jobs. Like
Yeah, that's great.
that's how we summarize it. So okay, so RevOps framework check. So we've got calculators for each of these, and so let's talk about we spent some time talking about leadership alignment. So let me talk about this first, and then I'm going to go to our website actually and show you kind of one of the live calculators where people can go tinker. And I can probably put the links in the chat here, right? But we can make this available to people afterwards. And please go to hyperscale.com. There's a big tab at the top, RevOps ROI, and you can self-service there, find what you want. No form fields required or anything. It's not gated. Just go. We want people to go tinker. Okay, so leadership alignment. We talked about what that means. So how do you quantify the value of doing that well, right? When you are aligned on the dashboards and you know what slides you're showing to the board and you know what the definition of an MQL is and what the conversion percentage is of a given sales stage. Like when you're actually aligned on all that, what is that worth? Well, for a lot of these, I think it's easier to focus on, what is the cost when it's going badly, right? And then like that's what it's worth to fix, right? If you got 100% of that. So, in that way, the simplest way to think about leadership alignment, and this is a very boiled down version, there's a lot of second order effects, is just the time wasted, right? When you think about the time that the teams spend, and by that I mean the leadership team, CRO, CMO, their lieutenants, right? The RevOps team, and then by extension, all of the other pieces that support them, right? Marketing and whatnot. When you aren't aligned on this, you spend hours arguing about what is the MQL, right? And then redo the report and come back and have another meeting, in 2 days to like relook at it, or again, late night requests to redo models and build slides, and that adds up, right, over time in terms of just the amount of hours spent. And so one simple way to think about the value is, okay, how expensive are these resources that we have in terms of their salary? How many hours are they wasting typically in a given month doing this, or quarter, or however you want to slice it? And okay, what does that imply in terms of savings, right? Now, I'll caveat this with like, calculation, like ROI calculations like this are nothing new. And the tricky thing about it is they're good for people getting a gut check of it, but it's not actual dollars that are saved because unless you're like firing people, right? Like those salary dollars aren't recouped, even if they're wasted. But nevertheless, it's showing you like, hey, I'm paying this person, a lot of money, and they're spending 10 hours a week arguing about what even the data says. Like, I think everyone can agree that doesn't make sense, right? And like some dollar value to that is reasonable. Um, so for each of these calculators, kind of the way we structured it is we've got, some pros, basically giving a version of the voiceover I just gave to what is this category, how do you think about it? Defining the variables in the equation, right? So we've, just kind of got all these laid out. In this case, it's, number of hours per month that the RevOps team wastes, basically ad hoc requests, dashboard changes, board deck iteration, anything in that category. What's the cost of a RevOps team member? You'd probably fully loaded average 150K, depending on the size of your organization and whatnot. How many working hours are there in a year? And then, how many hours does the C-suite spend on the same things, right? Wasting their time on the same kind of things, and what's their average cost, which is going to be a lot higher, right? In terms of what their time is, at least in theory, worth. So then you put these together, right? And then for each of these calculators, we have like we show the actual equation, right? So this is meant to be kind of like what you find in a math textbook, but hopefully a lot simpler. It's just a multiplication, right, of how you put these factors together. And for all these, we have like an example, right, of showing, showing the numbers, right, of hey, if we plug in these values, what do we get at the end, right? So in this case, if you do the math on this example, if the hours wasted per month for RevOps is 50, it's 30 for the executive team. You're paying your RevOps people again an average of 150. You're paying your executives an average of 250. Then what does that imply? It implies you're about $100,000, right? In terms of like, what is it worth to spend the time to get aligned for next year about the goals, the metrics, and all these things. That's easily worth $100,000 in terms of time saved. And again, I'll say all these calculators are intended just to be a starting point because obviously there's a lot of second order effects that are arguably more valuable than the literal hours saved, right? Like if you're arguing about the MQLs, and how this goes, then you probably aren't making the right decisions about which marketing channels to reinvest in, right? Because like you can't even agree on what the MQLs are and all that stuff. So in the attempt to not boil the ocean, we've kept these pretty simple. So for anyone looking, listening to this and then going and downloading it, right? Like keep that in mind if we're not claiming that this is like the entire equation of every piece of every penny that it's worth, but rather a starting point just to start to have some validation and some numbers to it. So, okay,
Yeah.
so I'll pause there on leadership alignment.
You took the words out of my mouth there at the end too, Ben. Is I think like this is kind of like the floor value of like ROI in terms of savings. But then like I think if I were using this to present a business case at my company, I'd say, okay, but think about what you, Mr. or Mrs. Executive, could do with this free time to actually move your function forward. And that becomes like beyond just the savings, like the growth. And I think those two things together, whereas
Yeah,
it might be harder to quantify the latter one. It's like, okay, this is at least 90K, but then paint
right.
like the picture that gets them excited for the future is like a really powerful combo.
Exactly. And that's a classic, kind of tactic for ROI when things are qualitative is come up with some really conservative estimates as a baseline and have people get their head around the fact that, oh, okay, we're talking about six figures of savings here, right? We're not talking about $10,000, And then when you start laying on all those extra order effects, people realistically are like, oh, okay, we're probably talking about $500,000, right? Or $1 million. And like that can be really effective, even if you don't have a cell by cell calculation of what that second order effect is. If you can paint that picture, people will get it of like, oh, okay, this is a big problem, it's a little problem, it's valuable, it's not valuable, and like that's the hump you have to get over, right? Ultimately, humans make decisions on emotions, right? As data driven as we all try to be in this world, CFOs included, right? And like if you can convince them in their gut that hey, this is a meaningful problem that we need to solve in a certain way, or if you're trying to just get the CRO to agree to, a consistent MQL definition, right? This is the way to have that conversation, right? So,
Yeah, totally.
um, yeah, so that's how that goes. Okay, so leadership alignment. I know we have maybe 10 minutes left here. I'll show briefly a more quantitative one, I guess, of let's go to data. Yeah, data foundation. So this is one. So the question here is, what is it worth to have clean data in your marketing automation system or your CRM? What is it worth, right? Like, okay, I've got, 30% duplicates. Why do I care, right? Like what everyone would agree, probably it's not a good thing, but how much is it actually costing you to have that? It's a really tricky thing to answer, right? And like, and I don't mean like how much do we pay ZoomInfo for the credits and all that stuff. Like, yeah, that's, cost as well, but what is it costing your organization in terms of their ability to do their jobs? So in our mind, there are two that you can calculate this two ways, right? For sales and for marketing. For sales, when you think about what's the impact of having bad data in your CRM, salespeople are using that data to reach out to people, right? You send emails, make calls, run sales loft cadences, whatever it is. And if your teams are expected to do outbound in that way, and they're not just servicing MQLs that are coming from the website, then whatever percentage of your data is bad, that's how much percentage of their prospecting time they're wasting because they're trying to call someone who doesn't work at that company anymore, or the phone number is wrong, or whatever it is, right? Like, and so they're wasting their time, and that has real implications of, okay, it's not just about, you could do a calculation here of how much is the salesperson paid, et cetera, but here we're trying to talk about more about the upside of how much sales are you missing out on? Because that time they spent calling people that don't exist, they could have spent calling people that do exist, right? Like, what does that mean? So, in our mind, the way that you would calculate that is you've got what percentage of your data is bad. Um, how much time does your sales team spend doing prospecting, and then what is their quota and how many salespeople do you have, right? So you put all this together, let's say, you have 10% of your data is bad. And I define bad data as, again, duplicate, incomplete, inaccurate, whatever, right? Something that isn't useful. And then, how much time do your reps spend prospecting of their time? right? So if it's 50% of their time, which is pretty typical for an outbound organization, great, you put in 50%. What's the quota per rep? Say $1 million, right? Change that for your organization with whatever's appropriate. And then how many reps do you have? And you do that calculation, right? And okay, the cost of my 10% bad data is about $500,000 a year, right? And that isn't like, oh, I'm paying somebody this money. It's like I could be capturing 500K more of sales pretty realistically, right? And the last thing I'll say on this piece is that if you have this conversation with the CRO and they push back on the approach, then you're like, okay, well, if you don't think they'd spend that extra time selling, like what else would they be doing? Right? Like what exactly, would your people be doing? It's if they, instead of calling bad contacts, right? They'd be calling good contacts, and then like, if they're good at their job, then that will translate to sales at whatever your normal percentages are, right? Like that kind of thing. So that's an attempt again of like taking this rather ethereal question of what is it worth to have good data in your CRM or marketing automation, et cetera, and how do you think about the implications of that, right? And like we said earlier, there's probably 4 or 5 other second order effects you could think of about why does this manifest, but this is one where you probably know these inputs, right? You know what the average quota is, you know how many reps you've got, et cetera. And so you can have this again as a starting point to have that conversation. That's the intent.
I absolutely love this one. To your point, take something kind of high level that everyone knows is bad, but I think a lot of companies, like RevOps folks aside, often aren't that willing to invest in cleaning up like dirty data because we can just throw heads at it or like it's fine. It's just like it's a priority 6 instead of 1, 2, or 3.
Yep.
But this is so awesome putting a number to it. And I'm reminded of I think a talk I listened to of Kyle Norton of Owner, whose team has done an amazing job of like creating an outbound system, and he actually specifically covered a good chunk of uh, his talk on a custom solution they did to improve their phone number data through a few different
Mhm.
providers for exactly this reason. And he said it was one of like the biggest unlocks they had for the business because the connect rate skyrocketed and it actually like ticked up growth in a step function. And so I think, yeah, I totally forgot about that, but this is a perfect example of that. And I also think like when you think about the limits of this formula, it's really thought-provoking too, because okay, maybe the CRO isn't so worried about a 10% bad data rate or doesn't really buy it, but it's like, okay, but imagine if it was 100%, that means we would never get in touch with anyone, right? So this does matter, right? So I think this is such a good way to like
Yep.
frame that discussion.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of the thought process, right? Of like, and again, it goes back to like, what is the value of having a CRM at all? It's a really tricky thing to measure, but you can, if you say like, okay, let's really think about that. What would it mean if we didn't have a CRM, right? What does it translate to? It's like wasted time, not being able to keep track of things, all the stuff that comes with that. And similarly for bad data, right? Like, that portion of your time is wasted if you're doing it. Um, okay, so that's just 2 examples, right? There's even another kind of sub one here for marketing, basically talking about like how many people you're putting through campaigns and how many of those contacts are incorrect. Therefore, you're wasting that marketing spend. You're missing the value of those MQLs that could turn into sales. Very analogous to the sales calculation we just walked through. So what I'm going to do now is I'll switch to, we just have a few minutes left. I'm going to switch to our website. So let me make sure. Can you guys see? Can you see the
I
RevOps
see the
ROI?
data foundation calculator.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So on the Hyperscayle website, up at the top, there's a RevOps ROI button. If you click on that and scroll down, there's the ebook you can download, but then there's also links to all these different calculators. You can bounce around and kind of go play with them, right? Um, and so we have here the equations again, but then we've got the ability where you can like, move these sliders around and put in numbers and stuff just to like tinker, right? You can do this in Excel easily enough. We're talking about like an equation with 4 variables that get multiplied together. So, suit yourself, right? But this is kind of an easy way to see it come to life. So yeah, so like in this example, if we take we'll do the sales one like we just talked about, right? Let's say, yeah, you got, I don't know, 15% bad data, which is honestly pretty good in a lot of places, right? Let's say your prospecting time is 50%, and let's say your quota is, $1 million and you got 10 sales reps. You multiply those together, right? And it's 750K, right? In terms of missed sales that you could be getting, that you're not. And it kind of makes sense, right? If you're wasting, 15% of your prospecting time and you've got a pretty heavy outbound quota number and 10 reps, I mean, that like, yeah, that's about right. You're probably wasting almost 10% of that, in terms of how you do it. So that's that's kind of how this is intended to be used. And so this can kind of get your gears turning. It's also something you can even point your peers to or other leaders of like letting them go in and play with it, right? Of like, oh, well, I don't think it's 15%. I think our data is only 10%. Okay, great. Well, then change it, right? it's still $500,000, So like this lets them kind of tinker around with it and just get a gut check of, does this sound reasonable or not? And again, you probably know the answers to these for your organizations. We tried to keep all these structured in a way that works for, like that actually you can find the inputs, right? So like what the outbound targets are for your reps, how much time they're supposed to be spending at least doing outbound, what percentage of your data are duplicates. Like you put all that in and like you have those inputs. They're not like guesses in terms of what those numbers are. Um, so again, we're just talking about multiplication and division here. There's nothing crazy, but we wanted to make this easy for people to go tinker around and kind of see it come to life. And so all of these are available on the website. Again, you don't even have to put in your email or anything. None of my salespeople are going to reach out to you, right? Like go play around. We sincerely hope it's useful, right? We're using this with our clients, often to help, the champions in a given account go justify projects to their superiors, right? Of like, why do I need to do X or why do I need to do Y? But for practitioners, like you're saying earlier, James, even if you're not talking about spending extra money on a system or hiring a consultancy, right? Like the value of doing a project. Hey, this is what I want to have my team spend their time on for the next 3 months. Why is that? We hope that this can be really useful, right? To kind of start with that and take it, make it your own. And sincerely, like, you guys can find me on LinkedIn. Like, I'd love to hear if you use this as a starting point and then you turn it into something customized for your company. I would love to hear about it, right? Of like, okay, what made sense? How did you tweak it? What's your thinking there? Because as I was trying to caveat at the start, I mean, this is our first attempt at it because we really haven't seen anyone make an attempt in this way of like having a RevOps focused ROI calculator. And so, but it's by no means perfect, right? It's a starting point. It's, by definition incomplete in a lot of areas, but we hope that it's useful, right? And that's kind of why we went to the trouble of doing it.
Yeah, this is awesome, Ben. Thanks a lot for sharing. I think it's great. I actually think, with your permission or maybe a footnote in our sales process, I might use the calculation on the leadership alignment because we hear that a lot when it comes to data.
Yeah.
And so I might need to rip that from you, like all great artists do. We have a few minutes left to our attendees. Have any questions? Throw in the Q&A. Going once, going twice. Ben's got a lot of great insight of using these in practice, so you can catch them before we go. We'll give you 10 more
Yeah.
seconds to see if they
I don't
come
know if you have
in.
we can send, I don't know if you want to send after the fact. We can send the links to this stuff too, James, but for
For
anyone who's
sure.
listening, you go to hyperscale.com. You can find this easy enough too. So,
Yeah, we'll follow up for sure. Cool, Ben. Well, thanks a lot. This was a lot of fun. Really appreciate you sharing this with us.
okay. Thanks, James. And thanks everyone for listening.
Cheers.